Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Science Friday live stream. My name is Diana Plasker. I am the Senior Manager of Experiences for Science Friday, joining you from somehow very sunny upstate New York this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us, no matter where you are joining from. Let's see in the chat where people are joining us from. So if you want to let us know, you can go to the chat, make sure you are signed in to a YouTube account, which usually is just a Google account to join us in the chat. We can let us know where you're joining from today. I see people joining from New Mexico, Minnesota, a few people from Iowa, Arizona. Amazing. Keep letting us know where you're from in the chat. And we would just love to know. So if you don't know us, I like to say that Science Friday is your one-stop shop for all things science news. We're well known for our weekly science radio show, which is broadcast every week on, you guessed it, Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. It is a great show. I, of course, am biased, but I love our show, and I hope that you will listen to it live on your local radio station, or you can go to sciencefriday.com and click the listen banner at the top of our page and also explore everything else that we've got going on our website. But today we are talking about this month's Science Friday Book Club pick, which is Origin, a Genetic History of the Americas by Jennifer Raff. Ooh, I got this copy from my local library this month. So if you want to join fellow readers to discuss this and our other book club picks together, you can do that on our community space. We'll leave a link to the chat in the chat for you to join us there anytime. We've been having some fantastic discussions in our community space about this book, so I hope that you will join us. As a kind reminder to everyone before we get started, Science Friday is committed to providing a welcoming and harassment-free environment for members of all ethnicities, ages, gender and trans statuses, sexual orientations, physical abilities, national origin, beliefs, or any other dimension of diversity. We've created a code of conduct, which you can read in its entirety on our community space, that helps us create a safe and positive community experience for all, and believe that providing clear expectations is a necessary part of building a respectful community. But here are the basics before you are able to give it a read yourself. Be supportive and respectful when speaking with one another and asking questions in the chat. Share generously and listen closely. You can add thoughts or ideas throughout our conversation in the chat, even if they aren't questions for our expert, although I do hope that you will post your questions for our expert in the chat. We're going to do our best to stay on topic. We're here to discuss this month's book club pick, Origin, and closely related topics. We reserve the right to ban anyone who engages in demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in the chat today. All right. Thank you for sticking with me. So many of you have let us know in the chat. I'm just going to do a quick overview of where you all are all joining us from. We've got people from Illinois, Oklahoma, Oregon, San Francisco Bay Area, Park Slope, New York, Syracuse, Minnesota, Illinois, California. Oh my gosh, another Brooklyn, New York, Hudson River Valley. Amazing. I'm so excited that you all are here. Thank you again. So thank you for sticking with me through my entire introduction. We are just 5 past the hour. And so it is time to welcome our special guest to today's live stream. So please, in the chat, put some claps, some emojis that sort of tell us how you feel about this month's book and our author, who is joining us today, Jennifer Raff. So Jennifer Raff is a genetic anthropologist and an assistant professor at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. She is the author of this month's Sci-Fi Book Club pick, Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas, an overview of the genetic evidence on the migration of people into the Americas and how these tools have helped reveal new details about our history and evolution. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me on, Diana.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And again, a reminder to our audience, we want your questions at any time during the event. If you have a question or a comment for our guest, put it in the chat. We will get to as many audience questions as possible. And thanks to all our community members who sent their questions in advance. We'll hopefully get to so many of those too. So, all right, Jennifer, let's just start with talking about sort of the big picture of your book. Your book sheds light on the new science around the peopling of the Americas thousands of years ago. Why is this question important to answer?
So yeah, it's really important to answer because, well, for a couple of reasons. For the scientific reason, the science of things, we have changed our understandings of how the Americas were peopled drastically thanks to the introduction of new kinds of evidence, genetic evidence, and also new archaeological discoveries. I don't want to minimize those. But this is part of a larger trend across the world, right? Where we're seeing the use of ancient DNA, paleogenomics, to investigate questions about population histories. And I want to it's sort of a lifelong career goal for me to try to help people better understand this field. And so I started with my sort of small corner of it, which is the Americas, and trying to understand how the Americas were peopled. And then there's a bigger, broader, more social, I guess, kind of answer to that. And that is, so since European settlers first came to the Americas, first started coming to the Americas, we, my ancestors, have used narratives about the origins of Native Americans as a tool to justify all kinds of things that they have done to these populations, everything from taking land to putting them into racial hierarchies and to discrimination, all sorts of things. And I think it's really important that while we talk about the science of the peopling of the Americas and the later population histories, we're also talking about the way the scientific data were collected, the practices that underlie this field and related fields, and so that we can understand how to do our work better. And so that's it's kind of a two-part answer there.
Yeah, I was really fascinated with that when I first read the book, because the whole section covers not just the modern, the whole book sort of covers the modern story of these questions about human origins of the continent, but you spend the first part of the book talking about the origins of this type of research and how settler colonialism, like you said, exploited the ancestors of these people across the Americas to try and understand them better, but doing all of these nefarious things along the way. Why was it important for you to start the book that way?
Well, I couldn't tell the story without talking about that. It is very much an issue at the forefront of my field, discussions in my field. And I think it's important to let people who are not actively engaged in the scientific research understand the kinds of discussions that we are having. Where we get our data from, I mean, these are from human beings who were once alive, mostly. I mean, sometimes we get them from non-human sources, but a lot of these are from human beings who are once alive, who are the ancestors of people living today. And that is a very fraught field. It's a fraught topic. And there are, I think, good ways to do this research, and there are bad ways to do this research. And we are really having an intense discussion about ethics right now in my field. And I just think that the public should be aware of this discussion and informed on it.
Well, so let's take a step back. What do you think most people were taught about how humans first came to the continent?
I think it depends on your age. So if you're my age, and I won't say, well, I don't know why I should be coy, I'm 45. And so if you're my age or older, you probably learned what we call the Clovis first model. And that model is this idea that the Americas were first peopled 13,000 years ago by a group of hunter-gatherers who lived in Siberia and raced across the Bering Land Bridge, that connection between Siberia and Alaska. And they raced across it following herds of mammoths. And they came down into the Americas through a route that opened up between the massive glaciers, the Laurentine and Cordilleran glaciers, which had been fused previously until about 14,000 years ago. They kind of came down this path, this ice-free corridor that opened up as the Earth was warming, and got into what is basically present-day United States no earlier than about 13,000 years ago. And that they left behind these remarkable, beautifully flaked stone tools, projectile points that are known as Clovis points, and a bunch of other artifacts that you see at different sites, but they're kind of, Clovis is what the points are, what this population is known for. You see these Clovis points pop up all across the United States, present-day United States, about 13,200 years ago, and then they persist for a couple hundred years, and then kind of technology evolves. Archaeologists long thought that was the sign of the first peoples in the Americas, and so that was a very powerful model. A corollary to that model is the thought that perhaps these people hunted mammoths, mastodons, glyptodons, all these giant ice age megafauna to extinction shortly after getting here. So that's the explanation for why we don't have mastodons around anymore, which we're all sad about.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool. Although I feel like if any of these like things that are currently really cool are also like not so well known, right? Like I feel like there are so many really amazing animals like sloths that were just like, yeah, it's a sloth, and it's like, no, it's actually like an amazing animal that if it existed, thousands of years ago and we didn't have anymore, we'd be like, oh man, wouldn't it be cool if sloths were around? But
Yes.
I do kind of wish that like mastodons and mammoths were around. They would be pretty cool. Well, okay, so you just gave us kind of like here's what people probably think if they recall their ideas from, the past on how people came to the Americas. How have new archaeological discoveries and genetic research, like the work that you do, upended that understanding?
Well, they've made it a lot more confusing. So there are some archaeologists, I would say there are multiple models now that people are debating between.
Hmm.
I would say that there are some archaeologists who still hold to a kind of a neo-Clovis first model. They're not that strict about it, but they do think that people came to the Americas not very long ago, maybe 14,000 years ago, but not much earlier than that. Okay. So that's kind of a young model, kind of an early migration model. There is another group of archaeologists, and I think it's really only archaeologists, a very small group on the complete opposite extreme, who think that the first peoples came into the Americas very, very, very early, like 150,000 years ago, give or take. That's a small group of archaeologists, but they're real archaeologists. They really believe it. They've gotten their paper published in a very prestigious journal. And then somewhere in between is a whole mess of archaeologists and geneticists where we're still trying to figure this out. Some of us think that the first peoples came to the Americas probably between about, 16 to 18,000 years ago. At that point in time, probably the only real way they could have gotten out of Alaska would have been along the West Coast by boat. Because at that point, the glaciers were fused. So you have this giant ice wall, as I call it anyway, blocking the way out of Alaska. Alaska's kind of like, some people call it a cul-de-sac. I wish I had a map here. I would point at it. But think of Alaska, it's like a cul-de-sac. And getting past out of Alaska is really challenging. But the first routes that seem to have been open for people to get out of Alaska would have been by about 18,000 years, maybe a little bit in that kind of window. And they would have been along the coast. So people could have traveled by a boat along the coast very rapidly and peopled the West Coast and then kind of moved inland, perhaps probably by river. So that's a group. And then there's another group of folks who think, well, maybe they were here even earlier than that. Maybe people were actually living in North America and South America quite early during the last glacial maximum, which is the ice age, basically, when people are really not supposed to be in the Americas. They're really supposed to be kind of in Eurasia, maybe in Beringia. But we have some archaeological evidence that's a bit disputed, but might seem to indicate that people were actually here by as early as 25,000 years ago. So wide range of views here.
Yeah, and by Beringia, you mean that sort of area as we get from like Eastern Asia into like the Alaska kind of official like American continent as we know of it, or North American continent.
Yeah, if you think about the Bering Land Bridge, that land connection, it was actually quite large. It was twice the size of Texas. Just to put it in perspective, huge.
Oh, land bridge doesn't even begin to.
I mean, yeah. I call it a lost continent. I mean, it was big. And so, a lot of people, myself included, think that there's a good likelihood people were actually living there, that this is a homeland, not just a bridge that people raced across.
So actually, we have a great question from our audience that was sent in advance from David, who asks, what would the corridor in the glacier that people traveled through look like? Would it have been like a vertical wall, thousands of feet high, kind of like the, George R. R. Martin's Tales, or was it more like a slope that was created by glacier melts? Can you paint a picture for us?
Yeah. Okay. So I did happen to take a peek and saw this question a little bit earlier. And so I was like, I don't know the answer to that, but I know somebody who does. So I went and asked my colleague, Dr. Rolf Mandel, who's here at the University of Kansas. He's a geoarchaeologist. And I was like, Rolf, tell me, was this actually, because I know there was some question about whether it was an ice wall, like a wall, a vertical wall, or was it a slope? So what Rolf told me was that really, it was a mile thick, this ice, enormous. And it was so heavy, he says, that in fact, it affected the landscape in front of it. So it actually caused the landscape in front of it, and presumably to the sides as well through that corridor, to rise from the weight of the glaciers behind it. Like, think about when you sit I'm thinking sit in a bed, right? And you push and you kind of see the covers bunch up. So he calls it a forebulge. For any geoarchaeologists, I'm just repeating this. I'm doing my best here.
It's a vocabulary word that we will test you all on later.
Yes. So Dr. Mandel said that it would not have been a gentle slope. It would have been steep. But he says that my analogy of well, he's never seen or watched Game of Thrones. Okay, fair enough. But he said my analogy of being at like a wall, maybe not quite as accurate as it could be. But he said that it definitely was a very steep slope. And then as the glacier retreated, the land in front of it rebounded, right? So you think about how it's all just been distorted, and then it kind of rebounds and kind of settles. And so I hope that gives you guys a little better idea. Now, in the corridor itself, it would have been very wet and very muddy, right? If you think about all this ice melting, I mean, it's happening right now in Kansas. It's everything, all the snow's melting. Everything is just muck. I think it would have been pretty gross in terms of.
So you would have be able to actually move through it, but would it have been like a nice place to cohabitate for hundreds or thousands of years?
Yeah, so environmental DNA studies have been done in the center of the corridor to look at, okay, how long would it have taken for it to be viable, right? So you can walk, it can be muddy and ice and, grossness, but like, when were there plants there? When were there animals there? This is kind of important because, people moving through this very long stretch of corridor need to find things to eat. And tools, stone tools, and, they need bone to make other tools with. And the earliest evidence, at least this study that I'm thinking of, looked at environmental DNA, and it showed that really this area would have been viable with animals and plants and so forth a little before 13,000 years ago. So, or maybe between 14 and 13,000 years ago. So, it took a little while. So it may not have been a great place initially when it opened.
Well, let's get back to talking specifically about your research. So what can genetic research tell us about these ancient people that archaeological digs can't, or how do the two kind of work in tandem?
Yeah, well, and there's a lot of other kinds of evidence too, right? So we've got archaeology, we've got genetics, we also have traditional indigenous knowledge. That's also incredibly important, and linguistic knowledge, which I don't think I really do much with, but I should do more with. But when it comes to genetic and archaeology, so all of these different fields have different data sets and different sort of areas of expertise, right? And they kind of all fit together, I think, to help us understand the past in a holistic way, or multiple ways sometimes. Archaeology is focused on material culture, right? So that's a fancy word for the stuff people leave behind, which might include stone tools, it might include hearths, might include cave paintings, or even animal bones that they've modified, right? So that's, that domain. And it can tell you a lot about culture and history and behavior. Genetics can't tell you so much about those things. What genetics can tell you about is biology and biological relationships between people. But it's really, really powerful. Like that, just knowing that is really extraordinary, because you can look at things from even a small scale, like we're two individuals who are buried together, genetically kin to each other, genetically related to each other. So you can look at a very small scale, or you can even genetically sex an individual looking at their chromosomes. So you can look at the small scale. You can also look at really big scale questions like this ancestor here. had these genetic variants at this point in time, what does that tell us about their ancestors? And what you can even get to the species level, or I would say maybe not species level, but looking at really broad scale questions about evolution, right? So how did humans evolve? What kinds of things did we inherit from Neanderthals genetically, and Denisovans and all these other kinds of humans that were around? And in between that, you've got all these different population questions you can address, like what was the size, the effective population size, the number of individuals breeding in a population 10,000 years ago, right? This can give us some incredible insights into the past, and it's just so cool.
We got a great question from one of our community members. They actually sent it in an audio, so I'm going to let them ask their own question now.
Hello, my name is Martin Mazar, and I live in Pleasant Hill, California. I'd like to hear how different the process would be if you were sampling my DNA from a buccal smear compared to the process for ancient degraded DNA, and how different that is. Okay, thank you.
What do you think? Is the process all that different, or is there like a whole different way of collecting ancient and modern DNA?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Martin. And I got to say, like, the community has had some amazing questions and methods over the last couple of weeks. I've really enjoyed looking at them. Okay, so yes, the first thing you've already said, right, is the source. So we typically get DNA from living people from buccal cells, like cheek cells. We swab their cheeks. Well, we have them swab their own cheeks, or we have them spit into a tube and just get their saliva. You can also get DNA from blood, but that's a bit more of a process, right? Maybe people don't want to have their blood drawn, right? It can hurt. People are afraid of needles. So spitting is much easier, or having your cheek swabbed. For an ancestor's DNA, that obviously is a little bit more involved. And so one of the things, I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm going to say one of the most important differences is consent. How do you actually get permission to do DNA research from living people versus ancestors? And how does that process differ? Well, so from living people, we have to go through a process that's very highly regulated to get approval for doing research on human subjects. I'm not going to get into the details on that, but it's a very highly regulated process. In the United States, that does not apply to deceased individuals. Deceased individuals cannot give informed consent on their own. And so this opens up a lot of questions in my field about who can give consent for research to be done on ancestors. A lot of different perspectives on that. I take the perspective that the descendant community or an affiliated community must have the right to say yes or no to any research that's done on their ancestors. That's the short version of that. Okay, so first is obtaining consent, and in the case of our research, it can take years, many years to get permission for a project and to do it in the right way. Once you can do it for an ancient individual, we sample whatever element we are given permission to sample, and in whatever way that we are given. So sometimes we treat ancestors' remains in very particular, careful ways according to the protocols of their descendants. But typically, if we get to choose, there are two sources of bone that we like to, we can choose bone or teeth. Sometimes if hair is preserved, you can get DNA from hair.
You can get DNA from hair from people who were alive tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah, you can. It's not easy.
Amazing.
None of this is easy, but it can happen if you have the right preservation conditions. You can even get DNA out of soil, and that's one of the most exciting new developments in our field. So the process of sampling is really careful. You've got to be very, very careful about avoiding contamination. In a modern person, a living person, you've got all kinds of DNA, and it's abundant, and it's in beautiful shape. In an ancestor, the DNA is very scarce, if it's present at all. Most of the time it's not. It's very scarce. It's fragmented. It's highly, highly damaged. And usually, you can usually only recover a little bit of it. So we have to take extraordinary precautions to make sure that the DNA that we're extracting is not contaminated by our own DNA or by the DNA of anybody who's ever handled that ancestor's remains before. And so we have to do our DNA extractions in a very specialized lab. And I think that answers the question, I hope.
Amazing. Yeah, it sounds like a wildly complicated process. And you talk a little bit about this. Your entire second section of the book is all about this process of like what it takes, not just to obtain the correct, consent for these projects, but also what it's like working in the lab. It's a many weeked process, and it's a very slow, deliberate process. And so yeah, tracking back, the first part of your book talking about like sort of the origins of this research. The second part is actually we get to go into the lab with you and see what this process actually looks and feels like. And then in the third part of your book, we get to sort of like the current understanding that we have on the peopling of the Americas. And then you talk a little bit about how we work with ancestor communities. So can you talk a little bit about how cultural and genetic anthropologists work in collaboration with Indigenous peoples and ancestor communities? And we actually have a comment that I'm going to elevate right now from one of our live stream attendees that reads, they went to a talk with an archaeologist and they were adamant that present day tribes have no right to artifacts. And they were pretty put off by this, and that your book gave them hope. So can we talk a little bit about the work that you and other genetic anthropologists and archaeologists are doing now in collaboration with those communities?
Yeah, and first, thank you. I'm sorry that happened to you, Sharon. I hope that this archaeologist changes their mind. I will say that is a minority opinion now in the field. That most archaeologists have come to a very good understanding that the practices of the past and the assumption that we are entitled to, we being scientists, and most of us, let's be frank, are non-native. The assumption that we are entitled to the artifacts and the art and the bodies of Indigenous peoples' ancestors, I think that there's been a dawning recognition that is inappropriate and that's untrue. Instead, this is getting replaced by a much more, I think, humble perspective on the part of scientists. I might be, wishful thinking, but actually the people I talk to who really do feel this way, that it's important for us to understand the past, but let's do this in partnership with tribes who already have all of this knowledge about their ancestors and have been harmed so badly by centuries of research done in a bad way. Why not work together and try to make the things better, more equitable, more just, and integrate these different perspectives? So I do think that the field is changing a lot, but there are still some people, archaeologists, geneticists, other people, other kinds of anthropologists and people in other disciplines who still maintain this idea, this attitude that, well, science trumps all. The pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is the most important thing. And I don't agree with that on any level. I think a lot of people are just a lot of scientists are just kind of ignorant and don't really I think maybe that's unfair of me to say. I think that there are some scientists who are just kind of ignorant and do not understand how to work with communities. And that's something that can be addressed and something that can be fixed. And I know lots of Indigenous geneticists and bioethicists and archaeologists who are doing amazing work to educate their colleagues, their non-native colleagues, into better practices. So what do those better practices entail and what do they look like? So the first thing that, and I'm speaking from a very United States centric perspective, because that's where I am. That's who I work with, people in this area. It's different for different parts of the world and different parts of the Americas. But the first thing that we scientists have to do is respect sovereignty. So Indigenous peoples belong to nations, tribes, communities that have the right to determine for themselves who is Indigenous and have the right to their ancestors' remains, their ancestors' artifacts, right? And so we have to respect that. And when we want to do research, whatever that research looks like, it needs to be designed in collaboration with these descendants. We can't just impose our ideas onto them and expect them to do whatever we want, right? So in my experience, and I am not a bioethicist, so I just apply the recommendations of bioethicists and Indigenous scholars to my work. But what I have found is that we work really well when we have clear communication with a tribe and we talk to them and we report to them, we ask them questions, we have the whole project designed before we even apply for funding. And then we really we try to develop relationships with that tribe, with the people in the community. It can be more difficult in some communities that are more remote. We do our best, but tribes have other priorities often than hanging out with the geneticists, right? But in some cases, we have great relationships with tribal members, and we ask them questions. We ask them how to do the work, how to design the work. We bring the questions that we might have to them and ask them, are these questions appropriate? Are they okay to ask? I have never, ever had a tribe say, no, don't ask these questions. They appreciate that I'm coming to them and being respectful and asking, how can I do this work in a good way?
That's amazing. Yeah, you spend a few chapters at the very end of your book talking about these, like how these collaborations have sort of come to fruition and sort of your hopes for them in the future. So I'm sure a lot of people will be following your work to see kind of what's happening in the next few years. You did touch on funding, and so I am going to ask this question from one of our community members. Deborah asks, how will the dismantling of federal funds affect your research?
Well, that's a big question. All my research is federally funded. And if there's no federal funding, there is no research. And that is true of myself and all my colleagues that I can think of. So yeah, it is really bad. Right now, so I've just completed one project, one grant, that's wound down. I'm working on the last year of another one. I have staff scientists who are doing the research who need to be paid. I have graduate students who are doing the research who need to be paid. I don't know how much the audience is familiar with overhead, or we call them indirect costs, but this has been a big topic for us, the NIH and NSF. In addition, so the money that is given, allocated to researchers in a competitive process, very, very hard to get grants, by the way. You are judged by your peers, and they will tell you if there's any weakness in your grant, you don't get or your project, you don't get the funding. So in addition to the research that goes to the researcher, the funding that goes to the researcher, additional funding goes to the institution, the university, and that money keeps our lights on. That money pays for everything and all the sort of structural things that we need in order to do our work. And that has been slashed or proposed to be slashed. It's a little unclear what's going on right now. Many of us are just confused. Without that money, the overheads being slashed, we are so screwed. I'm sorry. It's really bad. It's really, really bad. So if you care about science in the United States, please think about this, because there's not going to be any science done, really. It's all going to stop if we don't have funding. And yeah, it's pretty bleak right now. So thank you for asking that question, though.
Yeah, thank you for answering it. I know it's not a super fun question to answer, but it is real. And I think that it's important that people know how much of the research that's happening in the United States, but also the world, is because of federal funding and funding about things that don't necessarily make money, that are really help us understand the world and ourselves. And so that kind of stuff is really important, and it only happens because our governments fund them. And so this is the kind of stuff that is happening if that funding gets taken away. So thank you for talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to get to some other questions from our audience. That you all have been asking such good questions in the chat, so feel free to keep adding more. Let's see, we've got a question here from Dean that reads, is there any evidence that might show people traveling from the Western Hemisphere to Asia? So kind of like in the opposite direction that we've been talking about for today. Is there any evidence of that kind of migration as well?
Yes, absolutely. And great question. There is evidence, genetic evidence, of migrations of people back and forth between Alaska and Asia, between Greenland and Canada and Asia. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the Inuit, are very mobile, have been very mobile for thousands of years, and they move back and forth all the time. Now, if you're asking about early in history, very, very early, we actually have very limited archaeological evidence of anybody moving in any direction because that whole area is underwater now. So that's frustrating. Yeah. If anybody can
That I thought
out,
was so interesting, by the way, that you talked a lot about if we could just get people who would do underwater archaeology and genetic research, we would be able to maybe explore these areas more. I didn't realize how much of these areas are just fully submerged at this point.
Yeah, it's kind of a problem. So, and you think about, oh, why don't you just, go down and do some diving? It's twice the size of Texas, remember. So this is an enormous area. We don't really know where to go and what to look for. We're moving slightly out of my area because I'm not an archaeologist, let alone an underwater archaeologist. But my understanding is that there are strata that are actually dating to the correct time periods that have actually been elevated above sea level thanks to that isostatic rebound effect from the glaciers, right? And so archaeologists are investigating those strata to try to find out, what they can. But again, needle in a haystack doesn't cover it. I mean, Alaska itself has been very, very underexplored archaeologically. So there is a ton of work to do. But what we can see is that there are very clear cultural, archaeological connections between populations on both sides of the Bering Land Bridge, and that goes back very early in time, so as early as we can look. So, yeah, probably there was travel back and forth, but we don't have a whole lot more in the distant past to be able to say more about that.
Yeah, maybe one day. I mean, this is why we keep doing this research, right? Because maybe we will be able to see that history with more genetic research and more archaeological digs. We've got this great question from Earl. So actually, I was curious about the White Sands Locality 2 location you mentioned in the book. So this book was written a few years ago, so hopefully there have also been some perhaps updates in the last few years. But this was a location where there were actually footsteps found in the archaeological records. And so really cool stuff. And so Earl's question is, what's prevented the White Sands footprints from becoming a new paradigm for age of humans on the continent? So if I'm remembering correctly, these footsteps have been kind of dated back 20, 30,000 years. Can you tell us just a little bit about this location and then talk a little bit about Earl's curiosity?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought up White Sands because I think this is one of the most exciting things that's going on in our field right now, aside from ancient DNA. So for those of you who aren't familiar with White Sands, a set of footprints, actually more than a set, a lot of footprints have been found in sedimentary layers at the White Sands site in New Mexico, the White Sands in the White Sands National Park. And these footprints have been dated to between 21 and 23,000 years ago, right? People are not supposed to be in North America at that point in time. That is the height of the Ice Age, the last glacial maximum, when that ice sheet has covered, blocks the way out of Alaska, and everything is cold, and people are really supposed to be probably in Beringia or in Asia, not in North America. So if those dates hold true, that means people had to have come down into North America by 25,000 years ago, because after that, ice blocks the way. And these footprints are extraordinary. Now, I haven't gotten to go to the site. I was invited to go, and then it got closed for reasons, and I still haven't gotten to go. So hopefully someday. But they're footprints that span thousands of years. These are people living in that area along the bank of a lake, I think. And they're walking around and they're doing stuff and they're interacting and they're crossing paths with mastodons and giant ground sloths. And picking kids up and putting them down. And there's a lot of children footprints there too, like
That
children.
was the coolest thing. Is like you can tell from the footprints that someone was holding a child, like slightly heavier in one of their feet, and then put them down and then pick them back up. It's really cool.
Yes. It's so cool. If I had got to, if all this stuff had come out before Origin, I would have written a whole chapter on this. Instead, it was really just a text box. I was able to sneak it in, right before we published. So White Sands, yes, is a paradigm changer if it's real, right? And by real, I mean a legitimate archaeological site. And what is preventing it from becoming sort of this big paradigm shift is things tend to lag behind in science, right? And in archaeology, archaeologists are having intense discussions about what is White Sands. Is it actually a legitimate archaeological site? And if so, what does that mean? How can we understand it? And I guess I should correct myself. By legitimate archaeological site, I mean it's clearly a legitimate archaeological site. There are clearly human footprints. Now, maybe
it's not someone who went there and stamped footprints into the fossils, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so archaeologists tend to have these sort of criteria for what constitutes a legitimate site, and it is undisputed evidence of human presence, and it securely dated, and in undisturbed stratigraphic context, right? So you don't have mixing of geological layers or anything. Up until White Sands, really, there have been other sites put forward as candidates for evidence of humans in the Americas 25,000 years ago, whatever. But they've all been a bit very controversial because, it's not clear that it's really human presence. So you've got like a flaked rock. Is that made by humans? Was it caused? There are a lot of ways to break a rock and a lot of natural ways. And so there's been a lot of arguments about this. White Sands is human presence. These are human footprints. So the real question with White Sands is, how old are they? How old are these footprints? When they were first dated, they were dated by means of radiocarbon dating, these little seeds called rupia. And these seeds that were embedded in the footprints return these dates, 21 to 23,000 years ago. But it turns out that they actually tend to return older dates than are accurate in the presence of water, because I'm a little shaky on this, but I think they take up old carbon from the water. And so when they date them, they're dating that older carbon.
Cool.
So, yeah, I know, it is very cool. But there was a lot of controversy when this, like a lot of controversy when the dates were first published. I immediately believe them, but I'm not an archaeologist. So, but since that first paper has been published, other papers have come out by the same team that have dated the footprints in other ways, independent ways. So I think they have radiocarbon dated pollen found in the footprints. They've done, what is that? Luminescence dating, right? And don't ask me to explain that, I can't. But anyway, they've used multiple ways to date these footprints, and they're all returning roughly the same dates. So I'm persuaded some of the archaeologists I know who are very adamantly against an early human presence are now kind of wavering. So I think it's only a matter of time. We'll see. Now, two things. One is that this is at odds with the DNA evidence that seems to suggest a later expansion of populations. We can see genetically signatures of a population expansion. We know what that looks like genetically. And that seems to not be going on 25,000 years ago, but rather a little later, like 18 to 16,000 years ago. So what is that all about? We're trying to figure that out. The other thing is there's just been a new paper published right before I came on. I was reading it by the same team, where they have found at the site, they're still excavating the site, they found what they call linear traces. So lines in the sand along with the people, and along with the footprints. And what they suggest, and I haven't finished reading the paper, I'm sorry. They found, for example, a child walking in front of an adult who in turn was dragging something that made the linear feature behind them. So they're dragging things. So what can we learn about the behavior of these individuals? It's really, really exciting that the site is still being excavated.
That's really cool. I can't wait to hear more about this. I'm sure that the listeners here and our book club members will be following this one closely. So that's really cool. It's very cool to see literally just more evidence coming out. Ooh, we've got so many good questions, and we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to get to as many as I can. We've got this one from John. He's asking a little bit about the writing style, and which this is a great question because I was curious about this too. Your book includes a few vignettes imagining how the DNA actually got to the place where we ended up finding it. So you write this small passage about young children playing near a river and their teeth falling out, and that's how we sort of found these teeth kind of independent from, anything else. Of course, this is like one idea of how that might have happened. It really humanizes these moments, but can you talk to us a little bit about your thinking as you were writing these passages?
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, gosh, it was really, I've never written a book before, so I had no idea what I was doing.
It doesn't show, Jennifer.
Well, thank you. I hope I can, do as well in the future. We'll see. But my process for writing is just kind of flailing around until I get something. I hope my editor is not watching this. Anyway, so one of the things that I wanted to do was, one of the things that I struggle with, because I'm working with such deep time scales, is I really struggle with relating to the people I'm writing about or thinking about or doing research on, right? Because it's so abstract. People are living thousands of years ago. It's so much easier for me to feel a connection with people and imagine their day-to-day lives of people, 100 years ago, right? It's the farther back in time you go, the harder and more remote it seems. And it's very, I don't know, I find it challenging. So I assume the same thing is true for most people. And I really wanted people to come away from this book with a sense of these were people. They were living their lives just like we do. And how can I make that evident, not only to them, but also to myself? And so I kind of made up stories, which I do in my head all the time and have done for my whole life. I just make up stories constantly. And yeah, so I just kind of tried to do that. And I was really helped by two things. One is the fact that as I was writing this book, I just had a baby. And so I was raising this small child. And so many of these sources like the teeth come from little kids. Now, these teeth were lost naturally as, kids shed their teeth. And so I imagined, how could that have been? And so I tried to draw upon my experience as a brand new mother and put that into the story. And there are some really sad parts too. I'm not going to dwell on that, but, channeling my feelings about these things, and really trying to make the past vivid for myself and for the readers. The other thing is I have an amazing, brilliant sister who has an MFA in creative nonfiction. And so I would send her the sort of drafts that I would write that are, first drafts are always really crappy, and say, hey, how does this sound? Or does this make sense? And she would really help me, with them. So I really credit Julie for helping me a lot with making sure that my writing was more accessible. If I could help her, she would flag things that didn't make sense or, sounded off or were too jargony. So I'm very grateful to her for that.
I love that. It's nice to have those kinds of people in your back pocket as well that you can rely on for those things. That's great. So this question from Kate asks, given that we have so few DNA samples from such a large geographic area, how do you see a better understanding of movement patterns growing in the near term?
That's a great question, Kate. So I'm going to preface this by saying that remember, when we're talking about genomics or ancient genomes, paleogenomes, each genome is a record of human history, but not just of your parents, but of thousands of ancestors, right? So sometimes when I talk to archaeologists, there's a little bit of a disconnect because an archaeologist will say, well, how many samples are you looking at? And I'll be like, well, we have genomes from, 2 individuals, and that's telling us this thing and this pattern. And they'll be like, that's just 2 though. And I'm like, no, it's not the same thing as just 2 data points. These are 2 individuals whose ancestors include, thousands and thousands of ancestors. And we're actually dealing with population scale data here. It's not just, 2. So that's why geneticists are able to infer enormous swaths of history from very relatively few genomes. But it's not everything. And as we add more genomes into the data, into our understanding, into the analyses, we're getting more and more glimpses of much more complexity, biological complexity. So you're right. We need more genomes in order to have more understanding of a better understanding of the human biological history, better geographic coverage, better temporal coverage. But so as we add more genomes into our understanding, that's going to just broaden it. And we are learning about genetic variants and populations that we had no idea existed, and we would never have known existed except for from archaeological data alone. The other side of this, the other piece of this, though, is where I also see the field growing, or at least where I hope it grows, is in integrating the genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence more with Indigenous knowledge, prior Indigenous knowledge, because Indigenous peoples know their histories. How far back that goes, is an area of discussion, but there is a lot of, I think, very fruitful understandings that can be brought from the testing of hypotheses on either end, right? Hypotheses generated by genetic data, hypotheses generated by Indigenous histories, that we could bring things together. I would like to see more of that. And I think that there is a movement to do more of that. It's not really in my realm of expertise, but I do try to add, at least shed some light on people who are doing it.
That's amazing. Jennifer, we've come just about to the end of our time together. But I wanted to end just by asking you, so in the book, you speak about collaboration across scientific fields and ways of knowing, like you just mentioned, right? Archaeology, genetics, Indigenous histories, linguistics. What other areas of knowledge or research could aid in our complete understanding of the peopling of Americas that you would hope your book might be sort of a calling card in to those people or those areas of expertise?
Oh, that's a great question. If we're talking specifically about the peopling of the Americas, I think more paleo-environmental data would be really helpful. So understanding how to model ancient environments, we need more of that. That would be great. And that, because that helps us place both the archaeology and the genetics into an environmental setting and understand it better. We've already talked about Indigenous knowledge. I think linguistics would be really helpful. Again, it's hard to say how far back linguistic data can be used to reconstruct history, but surely there's a lot that we can learn from that. And I don't think I did it really justice in my book, although I do touch on it a little bit.
We also need those scuba diving archaeologists as well.
Yes.
So if anyone wants to get in on that, that would be great. Well, Jennifer, thank you again. This was such a really lovely conversation, and I'm so happy that you took the time to chat with our readers and our listeners. And thank you again for writing this book.
Thank you, Diana. Thanks to everybody who read it. I appreciate it.
Again, Jennifer Raff is a genetic anthropologist and an assistant professor at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas, and she wrote this month's book club pick, which again, Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas. So thank you again for being here today. Thanks again to our entire audience for sending your questions in advance and for asking your questions today. I try to write good and thoughtful questions, but it is absolutely nothing compared to the questions that you all come well prepared with. So I hope you'll keep joining us for the Sci-Fi Book Club. We are finishing out this month with Origin, but next month we're delving into fiction for a little bit. We're reading Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer. So I hope that you will continue the conversation with us there. So thanks again, Jennifer, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.